Hello, Infinity. I'm back, you're back. Let's get to experimenting. Today, I will be doubling the time I have to work on an art piece to see how it'll affect the quality of my work. I, like many artists, have the dream to be able to support myself solely off of the art I make. And there are so many ways to achieve that. It's kind of overwhelming, to be honest. Most options can take years to compound into something sustainable, but I want to start somewhere. So while I'm waiting for my community on YouTube to grow and while I'm slowly working on my passion projects in the background, I've thought about opening up commissions. Something a little bit more active to help keep my mind busy and maybe earn some money to invest back into my endeavors. But that means I need to know how long it takes me to finish a piece so I can figure out how many commissions I can take in at a time. Which is where today's art experiment comes from. I want to make sure I'm creating my highest quality in the most efficient amount of time. I plan to record my normal art process as a baseline, working on a piece until it got to the point I would consider it to be done, and feel the need to move on to a new piece. Then, calculating my total time, I would add up the hours of unedited footage, still including all the times I had to pause but left the recording running, because those pauses are also part of my art process. Make sure to incorporate stretches into your work. And finally, after some conversion math, that time would become the number I would be doubling as the experiment progressed. One more disclaimer before we get into the challenge itself. I do work a part-time job and have other adult responsibilities. So the hours I spend on each piece are not going to be consecutive, but rather broken up into manageable chunks whenever I had the free time. When starting out with a messy, rough sketch, I tend to use a basic, sketchy pencil brush that's already loaded into the program. I block everything out very easily and with reckless abandon. With a rough sketch, my goal is to get everything on the page as quickly as possible to see what I like and to see how the composition is pulling out. I obviously didn't like the first one, so I ended up deleting it and trying again. There's no shame in doing that. That's the whole point of doing a rough sketch. The pose I end up going with is nothing too crazy, just a simple holding out her quarterstaff and having a little bit of magic around her other hand. I wanted just a little bit of movement with the shot, but I obviously wasn't trying to go completely ham with this first drawing, since it's just going to be my baseline. After finishing my first rough sketch, I add another layer and go in with a different color, but same pencil, and try to refine everything. Just trying to make sure that I'm happy with everything's laying out while also adding some extra details and really starting to make the character feel like her. When choosing a color for this next sketch, I tend to go with something that is completely contrasting, which is why I'm going with the lime green option over the pink. It helps visualize everything a little bit better so that I'm not confusing which lines are on which layer. That has happened to me before and it can get pretty frustrating. And since these are just rough sketches, it doesn't really matter what the line work color is as long as I can tell what's going on. My process tends to repeat itself whenever I work. I usually end up going with a couple rounds of rough sketches, and then a rough pass of line art, and then colors, flats, rendering, cleaning up the line work, and adding any special effects. Of course, I'll be explaining each step a little bit more as they come up in the video. And you may be wondering, what am I drawing? I wanted subjects with a wide range of characteristics that can inspire new rendering techniques. I don't want to add too many variables, so I'll be staying in my comfort zone of humanoid characters. Though character design is a major part of what I do, for this experiment I would be pulling from pre-existing characters. No new little guys to add to my collection. I originally thought about doing characters from one of my side projects. However, given the nature of this experiment, I already run a high risk of burning myself out. I don't want the negative connotation of burnout to get associated with my passion projects, so instead I'll be drawing some fan art of my friends' Dungeons and Dragons characters. I got in the habit of drawing out our adventures as the campaign went on, so I'm already comfortable with their designs, and our most recent campaign just ended, so this will probably be the last time I draw the party. Zooming into the face here, this is when I switch from my sketching brush to my line art brush that I've altered slightly. I'm not a custom brush expert, I mostly just futz around until it suits my needs. I wanted a brush that mimicked the syrup brush from Procreate, something with a high pressure sensitivity that would dramatically change the line width the harder I press down with my pen. With this pen, I start to refine my details and start doing my first pass of line art. It usually is an incredibly messy process, nothing too refined, But it does help me hammer out all of those details, making sure that my character really starts to look like herself, and so that I am happy with how everything's looking. I did end up struggling so long on the face. Normally it's my favorite part to draw, but this time around I could not figure out where the eyes went. I think it might have been the angle that was tripping me up, and the fact that she has a different eye shape compared to my usual style. But either way, these eyes will continue to haunt me for the rest of the piece. I'm not quite sure what expression I was trying to go with here. I think in the end, I wanted something compassionate or maybe a little bit more concerned. I am much happier with the expression that I end up going with later in the piece. Oh, good lord, what did I do to that eye? Like I said, they haunt me for the rest of the piece. Either way, I push forward. Yes, I did give my D&D character the classic anime mom braid, where it's all kind of swooping off to the left. I did want her to have a more motherly feel, since she was going to be the party's designated healer. And also, I just thought it would be funny because there was the possibility that if she went down, the entire party was going down with her. So let's not let the anime mom pass away. But of course, even with this first pass of messy line art, I still want to try to get things as close to how they're going to look in the end. Unfortunately, I am still on my journey to learn how to draw clothing, so her outfit isn't exactly new or creative. It is pretty basic in your fantasy adventure. Simple overcoat, a nice capelet, and I did enjoy drawing the bracers on her wrists just to add a little bit of detail. Now, some artists might move on to do their final line art at this step, but at this point in my workflow, I tend to get so tired of drawing lines. So instead, I add a new layer onto the current one and grab my trusty lasso fill tool to slap in my base flat colors. It is an incredibly messy process. Colors barely end up in the general areas. I definitely don't bother to stay in the lines at this point. This step has two main goals in mind: to reset my artist's eye and to make decisions on my color palette. Having the large swatches of color in general areas allows me to compare them to each other and with the piece as a whole. For example, I was originally going to go with a more neon pink for her jacket, but seeing it next to her skin tone and cape, the more desaturated pink was a better choice. The loose lasso method also allows me to get the colors out quick and replace one that doesn't work out just as easily. And as you might have noticed, I get very zoomed in and precise when I do my line work. So, taking a break to be completely zoomed out and scribbling out blobs of color, it can help my brain to recenter, and I can more easily notice things I might have missed. I'm going in now for my second pass of the line art, and I actually want the line art color to be this soft navy color. However, because I'm drawing on top of it and I don't want to get my lines confused, I'm currently opting to using this lavender color because I think it'll contrast the other colors very nicely. I learned my lesson from the eyes, and I'm not playing this game anymore. I use the selection tool to very easily cut out the eye that I want, copied the selection onto a new layer, and flipped the layer horizontally to give myself a second eye. Quick, easy, no fuss, and I wasn't going to fight anymore. Detail. You'll also notice the brooch on her cape. That actually is going to be her holy symbol. It's supposed to be what she displays in battle to summon the power of the Wild Mother. Typically, it has a wheat symbol on it, or at least something representing the harvest. I switch over to cleaning everything up. And while I'm in the process of doing that, I would like to introduce you to who I'm drawing. It would only be fair that my baseline, the one that I'd be spending the least amount of time on, would be my character Petrichor Squall. Though her outfit has changed slightly throughout the adventure, I wanted to draw her in her starting outfit, going full circle if you will. And no, Petrichor was not my first ever D&D character. However, she was the first one to ever make it to the end of a campaign. Unfortunately, life got in the way, so most of the time I tried to play, the adventure would often fizzle out before we ever really got started. However, this time around, shout out to our amazing game master who was able to keep us consistently meeting, well, to the best of their ability. This campaign was already a few sessions in when my partner and I joined the group. So when designing her, I wanted to make sure Petrichor would balance out the group and fill out any roles that might have been missing from our ragtag group of goofs, which ultimately led Petrichor to being the healer. Funny enough, once we got to a high enough level, everyone else found ways to heal themselves on their own. So in the end, Petrichor ended up dealing more damage than she ended up healing. Yes, our dedicated healer was a cleric. They do have access to the best healing spells after all. I chose to play her as a peace domain cleric, which means a few times per long rest, she could imbue her allies with a magical bond and give them a bonus roll to add to any of their ability checks. It was like a bardic inspiration, but through the power of friendship instead. As for her visual design, she's a water genasi, an elemental that descends from genies. As the giant nerd that I am, yes, I did name my water character after the smell of rain. She has dark blue skin to mimic the depths of the ocean, and her hair is literally water. That I wanted to be reminiscent of a rushing stream. Petrichor magically braids her hair every day to keep any Feywild nastiness out. Whether or not I successfully portrayed the liquid aspect of her hair is still up for debate. I think part of the reason why her hair doesn't come across as water is that I will continuously add little bits of loose hair that make the hair look like hair instead of fluid water, if that makes any sense at all. It's the little flyaways that I feel like breaks the illusion of rushing water and ends up making it look more like hair. But I digress. As for her outfit, as a cleric of the peace domain and worshipper of the Wild Mother, I wanted her to look soft and comforting, while also being a bit nomadic, like a slightly more polished version of a witch in the woods. My original concept for Petrichor ended up being completely different with how I ended up playing her towards the end of the campaign. I originally wanted her to be a little anxious, but mostly be someone that the rest of the party could rely on, a soft spoken voice of reason. As of course the campaign went on and I continued to fail arcana checks against our rogue, I started to play Petrichor a little differently. One of my favorite parts of playing this campaign was that another character, the species that he chose, can't grow any facial hair. So, as a water genasi with the create and shape water spell, Petrichor, after seeing that her party member had gotten increasingly envious of another member of his species having facial hair, decided to create him a mustache out of ice. It was a really sweet moment in the campaign and really helped bonded the party members. Until towards the end of the campaign, when that particular member ended up becoming a bit of a fight on sight type character, and every time a fight was about to ensue or he was about to instigate something, she would threaten to stop creating his mustache so that he would once again have no facial hair. Sort of like a grounding situation. Another aspect of our campaign that was very interesting was that our DM had given us a trinket that was tied to a fey curse, and we had to find that trinket somewhere in the Feywilds. The first area that we were in the Feywilds was actually where her chess pieces were hidden, so potentially she was going to be the first to find her trinkets. However, because Petrichor had some trust issues, she never told her party about the trinkets. So there was a brief moment while she was unconscious that the other players were trying to get her trinkets back, and we're sitting there trying to figure out how they're going to be able to communicate her with her while she's unconscious and miles away. In the end, we were able to get those trinkets back, but it was just a really funny situation. Her untrust as a character and my stubbornness as a player, I almost lost the opportunity to be able to receive inspiration throughout the rest of the campaign. Of course, while I'm in the middle of cleaning up all of my flats, I also decide to go back in and add some variation to my line width. Though the brush that I use does a good job about varying the width of my strokes, I like to add a little bit of bevels in all of the corners, just a little additional shadow with the line art itself instead of the actual color. I don't exactly know what to call it, but it's just something that I enjoy to do and I think adds a little bit more depth and clarity in an image. I'll just end up going in and either adding a little swoop in a corner or thickening a line here or there, especially lines that are overlapping other aspects of her outfit. So the bottom of her holy symbol or any parts of fabric that tend to overlap each other, I think it helps add a lot of clarity and depth. Or it makes the fabric feel a little bit thicker or heavier, or it makes the item feel like it's sitting on top of another. I very quickly add a clipping mask above the line art layer so that I can start adding color back into it. Now, originally I was thinking about just making all of the line art that deep navy color, but I thought it would be a little bit more interesting if I did each individual part as its own separate color. So for the boots, I did a darker brown than the flats color, or for the jacket, I did a deeper pink. Just if there was a particular area that had a large amount of that color, I would take the flats color that I used for the area and did a darker version. Alrighty, time for the best part. It's time for rendering. So my rendering process is a little bit more involved than it has been in the past. So first things first, I gather up the palette that I'll be using for the rendering. So I take the eyedropper tool and select the flat color for the area. And then very similar to when I did the line art, I decrease the brightness a little bit to make a darker shade color. Then on the flip side, I increase the brightness a little bit to make a highlight color. And finally, I do a bit of an accent color. Specifically for the face, I change the hue to be a little bit more of a purple. It's at the same brightness as the flat, but it'll end up becoming my blush color. And the reason I went with purple is that because her skin color is blue, but my theory is that if she did have any blood as a water genasi, it would still be very similar to red. So when it would flush through the skin, it would give off a purple hue. After finalizing my palette, I go in to my layers and I add another layer. This is going to be the render layer. Then I go back to the layer that all my flats are on and I use the selection by color tool. This selection tool will make a selection off of areas that are colored with the same color. The reason I make that selection is that when I move back onto my render layer, I will be able to color in just the area that I want to render, which is incredibly important because the brush that I use is called the watercolor brush. And it is a beautiful blending brush that adds some nice speckling and it's not completely uniform. However, I don't know if it's an issue with the app that I use or the tablet itself, but every time I use this brush, it ends up glitching and adding very wide brush strokes across the entire piece. So to hopefully contain some of those stray brush marks, I use the selection tool to at least keep the colors contained to the same area that they're supposed to be in. And then of course I can blend out any of those stray brush strokes back into my final render. So the shadows and highlights that I'm using are not exactly going to be dependent on the light source of the piece itself. Instead, I'm focusing on areas where if the character was going to be completely bathed in light, there would still be a little bit of shadow due to overlapping parts of the body. So spaces like underneath the chin or the inner ear or around the nose or in the eye sockets, those places would all have a lot of shadow simply just by the nature of the shape of the head. Very similarly, the tips of the nose or the tips of the ears or the chin or any place that is exposed to what would be sunlight would have a little bit more of a highlighting aspect. Blushing, of course, I do around the nose and cheeks, but I also do at the tips of the ears and around the tips of the fingers and the joints of the fingers, because that's also where blushing naturally occurs on the body. The other reason I like to use the watercolor brush is that I think the texture lends very well to natural textures, a softness of a wool overcoat or the speckling of natural skin. I don't like any super clean blending. I feel like it looks a little bit too airbrushed, which is why I enjoy using the watercolor brush, because though it blends nicely, it's not completely clean and it is not completely smooth. The tips of petrichor Her shoes are also a brassy type metal, which I thought would be a nice little touch and kind of add a little bit more personality to the rest of her clothing. This, of course, is not going to be the last time I actually render a metal like this, and you'll be able to really tell the difference based off of how much time I spend on each render. So this is my attempt at rendering out her hair and trying to make it look a little bit more like water. If I had thought a little bit further about it, I might have done a lot more work with different layers and different types of layers, more like an overlay or a multiply, or at least making the flat color layer a little bit more transparent. I think that would have gone a long way in giving the appearance that her hair is actually water and not hair. And of course, I also very similarly did the same type of rendering as I did with the rest of the clothing and skin, which I feel like may have also contributed to it not giving the right vibe. Water would not be shaded the same way. It has a lot more refractions and a lot more light effects. But in the moment, I wasn't necessarily thinking about it. I was thinking about just finishing the piece instead. Alrighty, now we're moving on to lighting effects. So on a whole new layer that I've created a clipping mask as, I go back in with my favorite blending brush, the watercolor brush, and start adding this greenish tinged highlight to everywhere that I think the light would be hitting from my light source. Very commonly, it is coming up from the top right. That tends to be my favored lighting angle, and I wasn't exactly pushing myself for this piece, so I was sticking in my comfort zone for the angle of lighting. The reason I decided to go with the green tinge instead of a more subtle yellow is that I wanted it to feel like she was still a little bit in the swamp. But also, this was going to be a reflection of her magic. Her magic was going to give off a glow. Granted, I should have added the magic effects in before I started adding the lighting. It would have given me a better picture of how her magic was actually casting the light around her, but her magic was going to be this very similar green color because it was very much nature magic. Of course, the green does end up looking a little bit more yellow once I switch it over to a hard light blend mode layer, but I feel like the undertone is definitely still a little bit green. Then I go back in with the Q-tip blend tool and help soften up some of those edges so that the highlights aren't as harsh. Since everything in this piece is of a soft fabric or soft skin, it would not have any harsh lines in its highlights. Everything would be very soft and blended. I absolutely love the color I used for the shadow. It is this beautiful, deep, rich purple. I love using anything that is cool toned in the shadows, often going with purples or blues, and I think the one that I chose absolutely adds to the drama of this piece, and I think really helps make everything else in comparison pop, since it's such a vast contrast to all of the more desaturated colors of the rest of the piece. This purple is much more saturated. The layer mode that I leave the shadows on eventually becomes an easy burn that I leave at a much lower opacity. Here I am adding the laces to the shoes because I completely forgot to add them in every other step. That's also the beauty of having my liner at different layers, is that I can always go back in even after I add a whole bunch of details and fix something that I might have missed. And it'll end up underneath all of the highlights, so it'll have the same highlighted effect as the rest of the surrounding shoe. I go back in with the same colored green that I had used for the original highlights, and with the same watercolor brush, I start making some random strokes and brush lines and vague shapes around both her quarterstaff and her hand to imply the use of her natural magic. I really wanted something that was swirly and flowy, much like the water genasi aspects of herself. Something that really felt more like a fog or a mist, something that would encapsulate, and less like a straight beam of magic. And don't worry, the magic also got some highlights and shades to add just a little bit more definition as well. I felt that the piece was looking a little bit plain, so with the same fill lasso tool, I added a vague rectangular shape with rounded corners just to add a little bit of pop of color behind her, something that would highlight her but wouldn't distract her, and of course I went through a couple of iterations as to what color I think would suit her best. In the end, I ended up liking the purple gradient, and I added a little bit of a highlight filter behind her just to make sure that petrichor was still standing out from the background. Alrighty, the piece is all done. Ta-da! Time to do some math. Let's see. This piece took me 2 hours and 52 minutes and 13 seconds. Huh. Well, I am gonna round that up to 3 hours to make my math a little bit easier, but I genuinely thought this would have taken me longer. I'm gonna hold my thoughts on each piece until the end, but this doesn't exactly bode well for my process. Anyways, on to the next one. So continuing the experiment, this time around I would be doubling my original time, which should give me 6 whole hours that I should be working on this piece. Now that you're a little bit more familiar with my process, the beginnings of this piece is going to look very similar. Starting, of course, with my very messy rough sketch. Sometimes the sketch almost feels more like a thumbnail than an actual piece. It's so unpolished and sketchy. So I don't feel bad when I completely delete my first draft and completely delete my second draft. Allow me to introduce you to Roger Trench. Roger was my partner's character. Yes, his name is also a pun, named after the Jolly Roger, the flag often flown on pirate ships, and of course Mariana's Trench. And though I do love the visual aesthetic of pirates so much, I hate drawing them. I don't know what it is, I can't seem to figure it out. Specifically, drawing the tricorn hat is impossible, especially at an angle. The few times that I've tried to draw his hat, I've struggled every time. I think this might have been the first time I was actually able to draw the hat and make it look like the style of hat I was going for, and also make it look like it was sitting on his head. Much like the rest of the party, Roger also had his own quirks. He definitely was your standard kleptomaniac, stealing everything that wasn't bolted to the floor, but he also ended up picking a weirder habit throughout the campaign. Every time a creature that wasn't a humanoid was defeated in battle, Roger had an idea. It all started with a squid-like creature that sat upon a mannequin. Now, this creature stole Roger's hat and ran away, which was incredibly funny, especially because Roger loved that hat. So chasing after it and defeating the foul creature, Roger decided he needed justice. A hat for a hat, if you will. So he took the creature and asked the DM if he could turn it into a hat. And with a couple of surprisingly well and dedicated sleight of hand checks, he was actually able to fashion the poor creature into a hat, which he promptly gave to another character in the party. That party member can neither confirm nor deny the location of that hat once the campaign was over, but it did stick through the rest of the campaign. Much like the issues I was having drawing the second eye for Petrichor, I was having trouble making Roger's crossbow symmetrical, and given the fact that this is not an organic thing, but rather a tool that was machine made, it needed to be as symmetrical as I could make it because this perspective was almost a pure face-on shot. So instead of struggling, I just did the same thing, and much like the last time I was struggling to make something symmetrical, I just copied the line work of the good side of the crossbow and mirrored it horizontally onto a new layer. Problem solved. The hat incident was not the only time Roger decided to dip his toes into fashion design. The second time this happened was after a frog was swallowing members of our party whole. The one party member that wasn't swallowed was actually succeeding on animal handling checks and was very excited to have a new mount, but unfortunately, Roger was not too happy that the frog ate him. So, after some very interesting combat, the poor beast was also felled. But of course, Roger wasn't done there. This time around, instead of making a stylish hat, because the frog was so large, he instead decided to turn it into a cape, one where he could see through the eye holes of where the original frog was. I do apologize, it is incredibly gruesome, but yes, that is the cape that I am drawing in this image here. R.I.P. that poor frog. I also add a two-toned effect to his cape just to add a little bit more dimensionality and also to mimic a very similar way where frogs are often depicted lighter on the bottom and darker on top. When figuring out what I actually wanted to draw for this piece, I figured I had to do something overly dramatic and daring to really fit Roger's personality. One scene in particular comes to mind. We're in the middle of the Castle of Heart's Desire and are trying to leap across a giant chasm of time-freezing mist. Of course, our paladin was not dexterous enough to make it across, so Roger decided he needed to be a show-off and casually leaped off the balcony that we were all huddled around on, and Misty stepped onto a guard that was frozen in time in the middle of the chasm, and then casually leaped into the hole into the center of the palace. It was very funny and very on brand for a swashbuckler rogue with very little patience. But I figured that scene would play very well into creating a more dynamic pose and would give me something to base a background off of, since I needed to take a little bit more time on this piece. So you may have noticed while I'm doing the line art for the hand that something's missing. So me and this sword have some beef, to say the least. This sword is known as the Vorpal Sword, also known as Snickersnack. It is an incredibly powerful Fey artifact that Roger commandeered during one of his solo adventures. It's so powerful, in fact, that if a player were to roll a natural 20 on an attack, it will just lob off the head of whatever you're attacking. So of course Roger had to lay claim to this wonderful piece of weaponry, which means that I needed to add it into this piece. Except for the fact that I was terrifying. Because look at this thing! This is the most Feywild, pretty but impractical thing I've ever seen. Look at all those swirls and all those details. And on top of that, I decided I needed to draw it in perspective. So I decided to do the quick and easy route and decided to draw it on its own separate layer using the symmetry tool. At least then I could get it pretty close while also maintaining my style, and I didn't have to worry quite yet on making sure that everything was proportional while drawing in a perspective. This technique actually was incredibly helpful and useful. In the long run, I needed to do this. I probably should have done this for the crossbow as well. Another funny story about the sword is that it is specifically designed to fight the big bad of the entire campaign, a battle that we were excited and preparing for quite some time, until the very end of the campaign when we didn't realize that a certain course of action means that we didn't have to fight the big bad at all. Needless to say, both Roger and Roger's player were a little salty about the fact that they didn't get to use their new toy in the heat of battle. In fact, from the moment he found it to the moment that we finished the campaign, we didn't have a single session of combat. Now, to put the sword into perspective, I decided to use the transform tool and warp it just to add a little bit of that perspective back in, and so that the sword would make sense. Here you may notice I'm actually intentionally not drawing a pupil or iris. You see, our wonderful rogue also made a deal to sell the color of his eyes, so instead his expressions are often met with soulless white orbs. Though it might be a little creepy to see in person, I think it adds a very interesting layer of character design, and of course, if you don't have to worry about irises or pupils, you can't accidentally draw your character cross-eyed. At this point, I can't even remember what he actually sold his eye color for. I only remember that he was able to sell other stolen items back just so that he could then have his eye color, which was kept in a marble. Of course, instead of smashing the marble and getting his eye color back, he decided to keep it. Even though regular coin wasn't going to work in the Feywilds, Roger had the goal to be the richest man, and very quickly learned that everybody deals in trinkets. So the more trinkets he had, the richer he would be. Alrighty, now this is where Roger's piece differs from Petrichor's piece, and really starts to eat up some of that time frame that I'm trying to get through. As I mentioned before, this is an action scene from a castle. Specifically, Roger is leaping off of a balcony over a time chasm of death. I am still not going super crazy. I am not the best at backgrounds. It's definitely something that I still need to practice on, but all in all, I don't think this one turned out the worst. I started with some very bright saturated purple colors since I wanted it to be a little bit more dynamic. Plus, that tends to be the color palette and theming that was in the promotional material for the campaign module that we were running, so I figured it fit. Plus, I feel like it really made Roger pop out since he was more in the desaturated blue tones with his bright green. I feel like the contrast really makes him stand out from the background. I just used the lasso fill tool to block in all of the major points in the background that I'd be focusing on. So we have the balcony wall, the door that gets onto the balcony, and the bricks of the castle behind the balcony. Now, for the bricks themselves, originally I was going to hand paint each individual brick, and then I realized that that wasn't looking how I wanted it to, so I did the classic technique of doing straight lines across what was bricked and then dividing those lines one at a time with the erase tool. So you'd have your line and then you'd divide that line up with into separate chunks, and then you would stagger the next line and the chunks from there. I feel like it definitely gives off the brick vibe. For the balcony itself, I actually draw all of the lines at a rounded angle just to make sure that the balcony felt like it was popping out away from the wall and that it was a separate entity. And of course, I added some framing bricks around the doorway. I did a couple of overlay layers just to make sure that the bricks stood out from the wall color and faded back into the background. I also gave the bricks a couple layers of shadows and highlight, going into all of the lightest bits and adding a nice yellow while adding a little bit of a vignette around all of the corners to really make the scene feel like it had more depth. After getting all the bricks in place, I of course had to add the time-stopping mist. I mean, it was such an integral part of the scene. I used the same tool that I actually do all of my rendering with, the soft watercolor brush, and with a very light pink color, added little fluffy clouds, eventually going back in with a slightly darker shade to add a little bit more depth to the fog. The lighting on Roger is also a little bit different than it was with Petrichor. I decided to light him from the bottom, not for any particular reason other than I wanted to have the practice of dynamic lighting, which means that I had to shade everything a little bit differently and think about how I wanted the shadows to interact. I decided to use a dark blue for that color because I feel like it was complementary to the other shadow colors that I had used on the brick wall. And then for the highlights, I decided to do this bright neon pink because nothing really says Feywild castle like a bright neon pink. I feel like it definitely suits the magical Palace of Heart's Desire vibes that I was going for in this piece. I also go in with a different stippling tool to add a little bit more texturing to the bricks, just to make sure that they really felt like bricks and not just weird square blocks on the background wall. Alrighty, and this piece took me 5 hours, 26 minutes, and 34 seconds. Not exactly the 6 hours, but I feel like still in a comparable range of what I was going for. I still feel like I met my goal, and I'm quite happy with how this piece turned out. But this is where this experiment starts to get a little bit more challenging. I don't usually spend more than 8 hours on a piece, so I'm very curious to see how the next piece that's supposed to take 12 hours is going to turn out. For 3 out of 4 of the characters' players, I was given no visual representation of their characters, only descriptions given in session, which means I got to take some liberties when drawing out all their designs. Esnia, however, was the only character I had no hand in designing at all. Instead, I had the joy of using Esnia's player art as reference, which is totally awesome, by the way. I mean, I wish I could render clothing folds that well. I just knew I had to give their design justice, which did make me very nervous. Which, of course, is evident from me redoing this pose at least 4 or 5 times. I was getting so in my head about making sure that this was going to be the best possible piece that I could for this player. I wanted a really cool, epic, magical scene that involved Esnia summoning their familiar for the first time. I thought it would be really cool to have the swirling magic frame the piece, as well as adding in the familiar, which is a beautiful space-themed raven. Plus, given the fact that I was supposed to be spending a lot more time on this piece, I figured having 2 subjects in frame would also eat away a little bit at my time. Now, you would think that because I wanted to spend more time on the piece, I would have done a full body shot, but actually, I like the more intimate version with just Esnia and the familiar in the close proximity, and I feel like a body shot would take away from that, but it wouldn't necessarily take away from the epicness of the piece. Because I was getting so frustrated and I could not for the life of me figure out how I wanted to frame this piece, I actually broke down and did 4 different thumbnails, each one with a different idea that I thought might work better. I even had to look up pose references for individuals that keep birds and how they normally would pose while holding their bird, just to get some inspiration. Quite frankly, I don't even know why I was getting so in my head about it. This was just a challenge and it wasn't as big of a deal. So I did end up kind of liking the third option thumbnail that I did with the closeness and the bird coming in to rest on Esnia's hand. I felt like that captured the closeness and fondness that Esnia had for their familiar, but also gave me plenty of room to add some magical effects in the background. Of course, that's not where my troubles ended, because I was doing such a close-up shot, the hands were going to be more in focus, which means that I really needed to make sure that I was posing them correctly. And of course, I was struggling with that too, because hands are impossible to draw. I also, for some reason, couldn't nail down their face. Like, it was giving me such troubles. So a little bit of backstory. Esnia Dacus is a Githzerai lunar sorcerer. A little known fact about the Githzerai species from Dungeons & Dragons is that they have no nose. So I had to be very specific with how I was doing the nose bridge, because that was going to be the only indicator to still help add definition to the face. Unfortunately, I think I might have gone a little too Voldemort-y. Quite frankly, it wasn't the worst. Esnia, as a lunar sorcerer, was kind of our Feywild guide. Spending most of their time drifting through the Feywilds, they were quite familiar with all of the shenanigans that we were about to experience. Esnia ended up kind of being more of the voice of reason that I wanted Petrichor to be, which is funny because the players had admitted multiple times that the second session they ever played as Esnia, they ended up lighting a very important NPC's hat on fire, or at least tried to, and then was promptly kicked out of the carnival that was going to lead them to the rest of the adventure. Esnia also was the unfortunate player that received Roger's hat as a gift. Esnia can neither confirm nor deny what actually happened to the hat after the campaign was over. Going into the Raven here, Esnia's own player also provided some imagery for the Raven, and it is very beautiful. It's supposed to be reminiscent of the night sky, especially on a clear night where you can almost see the nebula itself. So I went in with a dark navy, almost black base. I didn't want pure black just because I felt like it would stand out too much and contrast a little too much. And if you actually look at the night sky, it's not necessarily black, especially if you're staring up from the face of the planet. I made sure the beak and the eyes were still reminiscent of the moon itself, also tying into the fact that Esnia is a lunar sorcerer. Then going in with my very galaxy-esque colors, I started adding some fun swooping shapes to imply the flow of the feathers. But that almost felt a little cartoony to me, so to add a little bit more texture, I wanted to blend everything out. So I went in with a very gritty, toothy brush and quote-unquote feathered out those large chunks of colors just to blend them a little bit more into the rest of the shape. It also allowed for the flow of the feathers to make a little bit more sense in my head, and also gave it a little bit more of that blended nebula feel that I was going for. And of course, what night sky isn't complete with a smattering of stars? I went in with the sponge brush and added a couple of the light little speckles of stars, but I also went in with the lasso fill tool to add in some larger stars as well. Again, my rendering technique hasn't really changed from piece to piece. It's still the same with the soft watercolor brush, while also adding the highlights, shadows, and complementary color to the base flat that particular piece had. I did a quick placeholder background because I knew I was eventually going to have to come back to that at some point, but I wasn't quite sure where I was at in my time frame, and I wanted to play around with the rendering first before I got sucked into the details. It felt very thematic to have Esnia summoning their night-themed familiar at dusk, which is the time when the night is summoned over the day. Unfortunately, I am completely heartbroken over the fact that I actually lost the recordings of me rendering out the magic. It is devastating. However, I just did a very similar technique with the Raven, where I did the large chunks of color and then used several different blur filter layers to add the mist and then added some sparkles and stars just to finish it off. Now for the actual background. My original thought was to have the scene be placed in a forest, so I tried my hand at doing some trees that would poke out, but I also was kind of speeding through it at this point because I wasn't 100% on how I wanted to do the background. But I also liked how I did the sky, and I felt like the trees ended up blocking way too much of it. Plus, I just don't like how I was trying to draw the trees, and most of it was going to get covered up by Esnia and the Raven anyways, so I feel like they weren't framing everything correctly. My first attempt with the trees was with a lasso fill tool and just kind of blocking out rough chunks, and then I went back in with a soft round brush and tried a very similar technique to Bob Ross, where you do a couple of strokes back and forth at rapid fire, making each stroke a little bit thicker as you get towards the base of the tree, which honestly worked surprisingly well for a digital program. They're not the worst trees I've ever drawn. However, they still weren't giving what I wanted, and again, I felt like the background light was just getting blocked out too much with the trees. So I deleted the background and tried again, this time just focusing with one tree. For the trunk, I used the lasso fill tool to add a very squiggly line, but then I went in with my simple lining brush that had a lot of variation, and I turned the brush size up a lot so that as I would casually draw my hand out very loosely, it would add these very organic looking branches. I also blocked out the shape for a wall because I felt like the background was a little bit more foreign. I wanted to make sure that the perspective still felt right. So a little bit of a retaining wall in the background just to add a little bit more definition to the bottom of the piece. Also, fortunately for me, the digital program that I use, Krita, has a leaf brush that works surprisingly well for what I needed. It's just a basic brush that came with the program, but it's it acts like a stamp, adding a couple of different leaf shapes in a vague formation. So I just did a couple of different shades of green and layered them on top of each other. And in the very end, I also added a couple splashes of pink just to add back some of that background color. Now for the wall itself, unlike how I did Roger's wall, this wall had to take me a little bit longer because I was still not using up as much time as I wanted to. So I did in fact hand block out each individual brick, which also made it feel a little bit more old and run down. None of the bricks were straight. It felt like the wall itself was sagging. I felt like it fit the scene very well. After that, I went in with a texture brush and added a couple of different blending layers over top of it at different opacities just to add a little bit more variation to the brick because I wanted it to look more like stone brick instead of terracotta brick like the original piece with Roger. I go in with another brush that has a lot of line width variation but has a little bit more grit to it to add a couple of cracks and scrapes along the wall since it was supposed to be a much older wall. Then I go around the bricks that were going to be in the background that were actually going to be visible, added a little bit of shadow underneath each individual brick and vice versa, added a little bit of highlight on top of each brick just to make them feel a little bit more three-dimensional. And that's where the piece was starting to look really good, almost to the point where I thought I might have been finished, until I glanced at the clock and realized that I had only used about 8 hours of the 12 hours I was supposed to be spending on this piece. Yikes. Well, time to futz around and find out, just to see what else I could possibly do to this piece to eat up some more of the time. First things first, I decided to adjust the saturation and brightness of the piece since I felt like Esnia got a little bit desaturated with all of the rendering I did. Then I added a little bit more of a vignette over top with this beautiful deep purple color coming from the right corner and then a little bit of a highlight color coming from the other side. I also added a gradient of green over top since I felt like Esnia's skin also got a little too desaturated for my liking. Since I felt like the piece was getting a little bit busy, I added a little bit of a glow effect border around Esnia and the Raven just to make sure that they were the main focus of the piece and popped off of the background a little bit. Also, at some point, I added a blur filter just to the background, just to push it a little bit further into the background. I also tried my hand with Krita's color balance tool, which was doing a lot of funky things to the piece, but wasn't exactly doing what I wanted it to. I also tried my hand with an S-curve just to balance out all of the values in the piece. I even tried my hand at a gradient map. Not quite sure if I was doing it correctly, but it was definitely fun to try out and mess around with, especially because at this point I was just doing things to have fun and to waste time. I realized that the magic was getting a little bit too desaturated with all of the different filter layers that I had put over top of it, so I decided to go in and manually erase all of those filters just where the magic and Esnia were, just to make sure that they still felt as saturated as I wanted them to. I also, for some reason, decided to add another dark border around Esnia as well, mostly just because I felt like they still weren't popping enough, and instead of a dark border around the bird, I decided to do a very light cyan color. And of course, a magical summoning piece isn't complete with a couple of random sparkles for no reason. I used the bubble tool and added a little bit of a motion blur filter. And just because I felt like it needed even more contrast and because I still wasn't done with my time, I added another vignette with a little bit of highlight and fog just to darken the background just a little bit more. I then of course added a soft white border around all of the magic because I felt like the details in that was getting lost with all of the detailing that I had been doing. And finally at that point I had to call it quits. There was simply nothing more I could do without potentially ruining the piece. And it looks like I only managed to work on this piece for 10 hours, 30 minutes, and 4 seconds. 2 hours shy of what my original time frame was supposed to be. However, this is where I decided to alter the parameters of my experiment. Instead of doubling the time for the challenge every time, I would just add the original baseline time that I used for Petrichor onto the time. So Petrichor to Roger was the 3 hours plus 3 hours, but Roger to Esnia was going to be 6 hours to 9 hours. So technically, I spent a longer amount of time with this than what was required. Yay, artist math! Hey, don't look at me like that. I have another challenge that I have to do, and this one is actually supposed to take a full 12 hours if we're following the new parameters that I've set up for myself. Alrighty. You know the process by now. This time around, however, since I struggled so hard with the background for Esnia, I decided to incorporate the background for Cold's piece right off the bat in my initial rough sketch, really trying to create a strong compositional feel that felt more like Cold Billy was involved in the scene and less like a creative senior photo with generic nature backdrop number 3. Also, my hope was to add all of these elements up front so that I could chip away at my time more effectively instead of twiddling my thumbs for 3 hours trying to figure out where else I could add unnecessary detail. So while we speed through my usual starting process, allow me to give you some backstory on Cold Billy and why I've saved his character for last. Cold Billy was originally only a humble dragonborn lettuce farmer, only becoming a paladin to earn some extra coin to save his farm from the devastating slug infestation. Of course, when our characters reached level 3, it was time for Cold to pick an oath to dedicate his life to. So obviously, Cold's player decided to subclass into barbarian instead, and proceeded to only take barbarian levels for the rest of the campaign, much to the confusion of the rest of the party, never taking one more level in paladin to take his oath and unlock a whole bunch of subclass features. Still to this day, I am baffled. Cold Billy also had a very fun character trait. He bowed to no one. On more than one occasion, the party ended up in combat because Cold refused to respect anyone who gave him orders. Most notably, Petrichor and Cold ended up in a Bullywug prison after a failed attempt to overthrow the current king. The plan after the coup was, of course, to install Cold as the new king of the Bullywugs. Thus, the running joke was born that Cold Billy was the true king of the bog. This was the exact reason why Petrichor was unconscious and miles away from Esnia and Roger, who were trying to get her trinket back from a evil bog hag. Ah, good times. That's Cold in a nutshell. He's our punchy knight in shining armor. Full plate armor. Oh yes. But it's not just any old metal. No. Cold's armor is magically enhanced solid gold that he acquired by successfully scamming a blind man. Oh, did I mention that the gold used to make his armor was also originally cursed gold coins? It was never really confirmed at the end of the campaign on whether or not Cold went back to the Bullywug territory to become king of the Bullywugs, or if he returned home to his farm, successful with his new riches of completing the campaign. But I like to imagine that he did both. He became king of the Bullywugs, and finally returned home, crown upon his head, back to his farm. We did make the joke that he had to add one more crop to his rotation. Since he only grew iceberg lettuce and the snails were absolutely devastating his crop, we made the joke that he should grow snap peas, and call them cold snaps. So I wanted this piece to feel very much like a page right out of a storybook, as the noble knight is returning to his farm after all of his adventures, crown upon his head, and new knowledge from his friends that he gained along the way. Whether it was words of wisdom from Esnia, a beautiful ice mustache from Petrichor, or just all of the extra gold that was given to him because Roger took their wish spell and wished for riches. Either way, I wanted a beautiful scene of him looking over his kingdom with pride in his heart, because he certainly had a lot of pride in his heart. Another funny story that ended up having some major consequences in the rest of our campaign was while we were finally in the Garden of Heart's Desire, some spoilers for the Witchlight campaign. If you don't want spoilers, you can skip to this point here. So the team is going around trying to figure out how to get into the castle and making sure that we don't miss any secrets that might aid us on our journey. While there, we run into Envy, a beautiful stone lion that is actually a demogorgon in disguise. Envy, being one of Zybilna's familiars, was not too keen on having strangers barge into their home, so demanded that we bow just to make sure that we were showing the proper respect. And of course, because Cold Billy bows to no one, he decides he's going to fight the lion instead. At this point, the rest of the party was already used to his shenanigans, so we decide to scatter around the room and see if we can find any additional secrets in the lair while we leave Cold to fight a demogorgon on his own. And through sheer luck, sheer absolute luck, he manages to fell the beast on his own, even after getting turned to stone for a round. Honestly, it was kind of impressive, until we realized that Envy was one of the keys to make our way around the castle due to locked doors. Yeah, we weren't too happy about that one. We probably should have gave it 2 extra thoughts before letting our paladin just wreak absolute havoc on Envy the Lion. So I ended up doing a different method to color in the line work than I did for Petrichor. Petrichor, I'd made a clipping mask of the line work layer and used the lasso fill tool to generally color in the line work of a certain area with a specific color. This time around, I decided to go in and hand line each individual piece with its specific line work color because it was going to eat up more of my time, and I also got to make sure that my line work was going to be as clean as possible. And of course, it wasn't just Cold Billy that I did the colored line work for. No, I decided to do colored line work for the background as well, even including these beautiful flowers. In fact, I was so dedicated to having colored line work, I even hand-drawn all of the wood grain for the sign, just to add that extra flair and going the extra mile and also wasting as much time as possible. Whether or not it was worth it in the end, I'm not quite sure, but it does look pretty cool without the flat colors. The line work really stands out against the white background. Speaking of backgrounds, I wanted the time of day for this piece to be very early morning, with the sun just crusting over the hills, bathing Cold Billy's farm in beautiful light. I wanted each ray of light to be a couple different shades of yellow in alternating light and darkness. So as it would move away from the sun, it would get darker, but each section of the sky would also potentially be lighter or darker based on where it was. Unfortunately, that looked a little bit too much like a carnival tent and wasn't quite the vibe I was going for. So instead, I decided to do a simple gradient of almost a complete rainbow, starting with all of my warm, bright colors and finally fading into the pale blue light of a morning sky. As for the clouds, I wanted some very fluffy, cartoony style clouds. I felt like they would go very well with the overall storybook feel that I was trying to give with this piece. I made them a nice cream color and then added a beautiful purple shadow in the background. And of course, to still get my sun ray effect, I added a overlay layer with a nice pale color to add a little bit of brightness for those sunbeams. Of course, I wasn't super happy with the clouds. I ended up blending them a little bit more and adding some gradient to the shadows just to see if I could give them a little bit more definition. And because I was spending so much time on this piece and wanted it to be as good as possible, I decided that I would hand letter the sign as well. Of course, hand lettering at perspective is incredibly irritating, so I decided to make it its own layer and warp it into place. Of course, it's the original sign from when Cold first opened his farm, but with his new moniker very cautiously painted in the corner. I wanted it to really feel like Cold just added the king portion over top of it very recently, so that it was new paint over old faded paint. And because I was spending so much time on this piece, I actually figured out a way that I really enjoy rendering grass. So first things first, I block in all of my different shades of grass with the lasso fill tool in varying different shades of green, ranging from a bright, almost neon green to a very desaturated, darker green. More grass rendering to come. Also, it's at this point that I decided I actually needed to label all of my layers, or at least group all of the major chunks together. So Cold Billy was his own layer, and then I had a mid-ground layer, which was the farmlands, hills, and Cold Billy's farmhouse in the background, also including the sign. And finally, there was the sky layer. Since each layer was going to have both line work, flats, and rendering colors, I figured it would probably just be best to group all of them together just so that it was a little less confusing. Now, when rendering Cold Billy's skin, I actually started off with my usual method of using the soft watercolor brush in the different varying shades, but because Cold Billy is a dragonborn, I needed to add some scales, which, lucky for me, Krita also has a pretty decent scale brush, but it wasn't exactly doing what I wanted to. At first, I tried a much darker color just so that the brush strokes would contrast the rest of Cold Billy's skin, but I felt like it looked a little sickly and almost like pores, so I went in with a lighter color over top, which I felt like really made those scales pop and made him feel more like a scaly dragon and less like an abomination with a bunch of holes. I also went in and added some extra detailing to his horn, making them feel a little bit more spirally and ivory, just to add a little extra detail for fun. I didn't go too crazy with the gemstones, I just did a couple of vague shapes with the hard lines, and because gemstones are glossy hard surfaces, it actually makes sense for them to have very harsh shading instead of my usual soft blended shading, just to make them feel more stone-like and glossy. So even though Cold Billy was a barbarian for most of our campaign, at his very core, at the beginning of his journey, he was a paladin. So I felt like he needed his own coat of arms to go on the, I want to say butt flap. I know that it has to have a more proper term, but the flap of fabric that is over his behind. And what better to simplify the House of Cold Billy with a beautiful cabbage. I also hand sketched Celtic knots, which, let me tell you, if you don't look up a tutorial, it can be very complicating and very irritating. It's much more involved than I was originally thinking, which is good for me because it wasted a lot of time. And I did like how it turned out. It was very pretty. I felt like the Celtic knots and simple gold filigree would pair well with the navy blue with the fabric parts of his attire. It also made it feel a little bit more regal and more knightly. Just a few little extra sparkles here and there, just to add a little bit more definition and fluff, and also to fill in that void as much as possible. Paladins in D&D are often known for having excessive amounts of detail, which is part of the reason why Cold Billy was left to last, because if I was gonna have to spend a large amount of time on this piece, might as well spend the most amount of time on this piece. I also like the appearance of the stained glass that the little star motifs gave off. I feel like it really ties into the medieval paladin style that I was going for. Speaking of excessive detail, I once again add some bricks and texture to the buildings in the background, just to break up any flat color. Really, the theme of this piece was, if there's flat color, it needs to be broken up with some random texture or unnecessary detail. Alright, it's time. I have to render out his armor before I get any further into this piece. I've delayed the inevitable long enough. So how, in the 12 realms of chaos, does someone render out full plate armor in gold? I've only tried to render out his armor once before, and it wasn't exactly my best work. This time, I made sure to look up plenty of references beforehand, and I think I was able to break it down to a manageable process. First things first, I needed more than my usual 4 colors. I needed 2 additional shadow shades, darker than my original one. One of those shades actually ended up being a desaturated green instead of a desaturated yellow, and in the same way, I also needed 2 additional brighter highlights. Going in with my darkest shadow shade and my trusty soft watercolor brush, I start to block in all of the shadows, not just going nilly-willy, but rather trying to define the shape of each individual armor piece with the shadows. The best way I could do that was to either add very sharp, harsh lines to areas to add a crease, or very soft, rounded lines if I wanted to imply something was forming to the body. The soft watercolor brush also lended very well to a weathered and worn texture that would go well with the metal of the armor. Really, from there, it was just building up my forms with the different shadow shades. Anything furthest away from this light source, this time being the sun, would often be met with the darkest shade or the green, just to add a little bit more contrast and depth into the shadow. And as it wrapped around, or might have reflected off of a different piece of metal, went up in brightness and saturation. If you look at real plate metal, a lot of the shadow shapes are very odd and angular. It is mostly just a lot of blending and implying form to make your 2-dimensional thing look 3-dimensional. Another note of advice, sometimes shadows don't butt up right next to each other, and 2 shadows could be broken up with a highlight color if you really needed to define a crisp edge to a form. I also went back in and started with my flat color once again, just to make sure that I was happy with where the shadows were being broken off, and then went in with my highlight colors. This time around adding very little highlights, but really trying to concentrate it on areas that are closest to the sunlight or are right before a shadow color. The contrast is what I feel like gives the metal its appearance of being very shiny and reflective. Because Cold Billy was being backlit by the sun, most of his armor was going to be in shadow, which is why most of my piece was spent blocking out all of those different shadow colors, whereas the highlights were used very sparingly in very small amounts. Especially the brighter I would get. It got to the point where I very rarely used my brightest highlight color, only to add the barest of definitions because of the sun glinting off of the metal. Alrighty, back to the grass. I'm sure everybody was curious about it. So this time around, I used a very similar watercolor brush and blended all of the different shades of grass color together just to add a little bit of softness to everything. I also had to make sure that Cold Billy was casting a shadow because of how harsh the angle of light was and because of the flowers and how close they were to the perspective of the viewer. They also would cast a little bit of shadow on the hill as well. Now, here's where I feel like the real magic happened to make it feel more like a field and less just like random grass. Since Cold Billy definitely doesn't do a whole lot of landscaping when it comes to his farming. I go in with a very pale white and use a sponge brush to add little splotches of white here and there in the backfield, just to make it feel a little bit more like fog or like little puffs of weeds popping up. And then I take a Krita grass brush and in varying shades of desaturated yellow, almost the bronzy color that I used for the armor, I make sure that the brush size is much bigger the closer it would get to Cold because he's the closest in perspective. Then finally, I would take a different sponge brush and with a couple shades of purple and pink, I added a couple of extra splashes of color to the backfield to imply the versions of flowers. That's the beauty of having the field so far away from the subject, is that it didn't have to add a lot of detail to make it feel like it was a beautiful field of flowers. And now for the third time that I ended up doing the sky. I felt like the second sky that I did felt more like a sunset at afternoon and less like dawn cresting over the hill. So I went back to the drawing board and added a nice pale blue to the sky to make it feel more like morning. Then with the clouds, I took away the purple and made them the nice pale, and then used a noise texture brush to blend them out into the sky to make them seem a lot more soft and fluffy. Then with a different texture brush, I added the gradient back, making it feel more like paint strokes and less like chunks of color that were blended together. And of course I deleted the clouds again and used the same texture brush because I really liked the feel that it gave off and added the white fluffy clouds back into the scene, then gave them their own different shadow colors. And quite frankly, it ended up very similar to how I originally did the sky, but I like this version a little bit better. If it wasn't obvious, Cold Billy got into a lot of scraps throughout our campaign, so his armor would not be as polished and pristine as seen in the drawing. So I had to scuff him up a little bit. I used a very warbly texture brush that had an incredibly high pen sensitivity when it came to pressure. I barely had to touch the screen to do very thin lines, and the more I touched on the screen, the crazier the line would get. So I would relax my wrist and very carefully draw out little scratches and dings all over in this beautiful shadow color. Then I would come back in with a different highlight color. It's just a little bit lighter than the highlight color that I had used for the rest of the armor, and added some extra wear and tear to areas that would rub up against each other. This is considered weathering, and when dealing with most metals, spaces that would rub up against each other, like the very edge of his axe or the different joints of his armor, would actually start to lighten. I also added some highlight strokes to some of the gouges just to make them feel like they were a little bit deeper into the metal. And of course, I couldn't forget about Cold Billy's main export. Because I was so happy with the line work I had originally done for the cabbage on his filigree, I decided to just copy from selection and color it in green, then duplicated it a whole bunch of times and placed them into the field. Hey, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And besides, the cabbages were going to be so far away that I didn't exactly want to spend too much time adding detail on something that nobody would ever see. Speaking of which, I also added a few birds in the sky as well. Finally, I went back in and used the same noise brush tool and the light blue to add the sun rays back in. I transformed it into a soft light layer just to brighten up the patches of the sun rays. Of course, I still had plenty of time, so I went back in and started adding my highlights and shadows. Specifically for Cold's armor, I did this very bright saturated yellow on all of the parts that I think would have highlight. Now you might be saying, well, you added all of that detail into the armor. Why would you add highlights and shadows again? And to that I say, because I can, and because I had to waste a lot more time. I also went back in and started adding my shadow shade as well, which was a very light blue color. It's at this point that I felt like I had accidentally made his armor a little bit more bronzy than I wanted it to be. It ended up looking kind of greenish in a way. So I added another layer of yellow over top just to try to nudge it back into that gold color. Now it wouldn't be fair to give Cold Billy's armor some wear and tear without giving Cold Billy himself a little bit of wear and tear as well. I went back in with the same wobbly brush and added some scratches and scars along our poor Dragonborn's face, just to make sure that he felt like he was actually in the battle as well. I used the same method of the soft watercolor brush to add some extra shadow and shading, and the same soft blue to add a little bit of extra shading on his face since the lighting in the scene was going to be so dramatic. I even had to add a couple of chips to his horn because there's no way that would have ended up unscathed as well. And of course, I'm still not done. I wasn't exactly happy with how I did the sign for Cold Billy's farm, so I decided to redo that completely as well. My original gripe was that I don't think I spaced the lettering very well, so I traced around the sign to make sure that I had a good size guide and used a different brush because I felt the texture matched a painted on sign a little bit better. To imply that this was fresh paint, I went back in and manually added a couple of paint drips just to really sell the fact that this was freshly painted. I also included a couple of white highlights just to really sell the fact that the paint is definitely still a little wet. And the more I thought about it, I also added a couple of drips to the old paint as well, just skipped the white highlights because it would be old and faded. After warping the sign into place just to make sure I was much more happy with the alignment, I went back in and started erasing some of the old faded paint just to make sure that it really felt like it was part of the sign. I even zoomed in very closely and in the big gouges of the old wood of the sign since it wouldn't actually be standing there. I feel like going in and adding this extra detail really made it feel like the paint was part of the sign. Okay, now it's time for the true shadows and highlights of the rest of the piece. Yes, that's right, I'm adding even more shadows. I went in and added this really dark, rich purple to everything that was closest to the viewer. So Cold Billy, the sign, and the shadows of the flowers. Then I added a secondary shadow to each piece that was slightly closer to the sun that was a little bit lighter of a purple. This same purple would be the shadow that I would use for the hills and the house because it was closer to the sunlight, and therefore, in my mind, logically, the shadows would be a little bit lighter. Of course, still adding a little bit of that dark purple in any areas that would really be in shadow. Finally, I added that bright yellow highlights to everywhere that the sun would be peeking over the edges of to really sell the fact that this is backlit by a very bright, beautiful sun. As a little extra detail, I added a little bit of glow to the windows of the house, maybe implying that Cold Billy might have settled down after his time as an adventurer. Who knows? It could also just be the sun peeking through the windows of the house, casting a little bit of glow behind the house. Cold Billy's piece got the same treatment that Esnia's piece got, where I had pretty much done everything that I set out to do, but still felt like I might have been shorting myself on the time a little bit, so I added some extra filter layers just in case and messed around with the piece a little bit more. So I did some color adjustments, added some noise and blur to the background, and really just messed around with the settings until I felt like the piece was where I wanted it to be. I also boosted a little bit of the saturation just to warm up the piece a little bit more to give it that old storybook feel. And finally, I had to add a little extra sparkle and pizzazz to really sell the fact that Cold Billy's armor was still very shiny and pristine. And here he is. And quite frankly, I really like how this piece turned out. And of course, for the grand total of this final piece, the time I spent on it was 14 hours, 3 minutes, and 43 seconds, which of course was longer than the 12 hours that I was expecting myself to spend on this piece, but is definitely a far stone's throw from the full 24 hours that I was originally supposed to spend on this piece. So was my experiment a success? And did I actually learn anything from spending extra time on all of my pieces? Was my extra time actually worth it? So obviously from a technical standpoint, the pieces I spent more time on were gonna be better. But the real question is, do I like them more? It would be different if I were working on these for a client, The projects wouldn't be sent over until everything was perfect, but these particular pieces I made for me, mostly just out of curiosity. I mean, it was nice for those of you watching to have some visuals to go along with my ramblings, but when it comes down to it, I really just made them for me. So, what are my opinions? Well, first things first, if I think a piece only took me 3 hours to make, I really need to take a full 24-hour reset and come back with fresh eyes. If I had done that for my first piece, I would have caught all of the stray brush strokes caused by my watercolor brush glitching. I also probably would have gone back in and completely redone how I did Petrichor's magic, because personally, it's not to a quality I'd be confident in giving a client. I know now that I could do a lot better. I also should not be speeding through important foundational steps. Petrichor deserved at least one more attempt to redraw her face. On the flip side, obviously, I should not be wasting time making random edits on a piece just because I think it should take me longer. There were several points when working on Esnia and Cold Billy's pieces where I would have deemed the whole project done, but because I had the imaginary timer over my head, I continued to futz around and find out, and quite frankly, I think those extra edits ended up reducing the quality significantly, especially in Esnia's drawing. I think the jacket got way too blue, and unfortunately, after all my hard work, and all of the detailing and weathering I had done to Cold Billy's armor, it all ended up kind of getting blurred in the mountain of shading and filters I ended up adding. So, what works best for me? Well, it looks like my ideal work time is roughly between 7 and 10 hours, split into manageable 1 to 4 hour chunks, with, of course, a 24-hour reset period before I do my final checks and consider a piece finished. Of course, it's going to be a little different for every project, and the time might change as I find smarter ways to work. In the end, I understand my workflow as an artist a whole lot better, and hopefully, if you're still watching, you got something out of this too, even if it was just laughing at my chaos for a bit. Hey, look at that! You made it all the way to the end of my video. If that means you liked my little pocket of the internet, thanks. That means a lot. If you seek even more chaos, you might enjoy one of these other videos here. I can also be found across the Webverse on Kara, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Tumblr. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Okay, bye.